Okay, students, my name is Alan Gautran. I'm the instructor for this course, World History 2. Today we're going to be talking about absolutism and empire. A lot of the information that you already have is on your syllabus, which is under the Files tab of the Canvas software. So if you go under there, you'll be able to see it. Today we're going to talk about absolutism. This is where we're going to start. Any questions on tests or grading are covered by the syllabus. If you have any questions, you can reach me at agotro@nunez.edu. I answer my emails fairly quickly. So let's begin. Absolutism defined, absolutism is a political theory that encouraged rulers to claim complete sovereignty within their territories, sometimes defined by divine right. Now, this created a somewhat of an attitude amongst the kings of Europe because they believed that only God gave them the power to rule and that only God could take it away. The age of absolutism was an age of empire. There were a lot of colonial rivalries at the time that we're going to see. Now, I'm not going to lecture the whole time on the PowerPoint. I'm going to put the PowerPoint up. If you would like to view it in its entirety, it will be there. And I will also start this lecture with this PowerPoint. There were a rise of limited monarchies and republics. And we're also going to talk about the Romanov family in Russia. It was a Russian autocracy, which meant there was no other rule but the Tsar. This is a photo of Charles II, who ruled from 1660 to 1685 in his coronation robes. He would later be overthrown through what was known the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and I'm sorry, James II, his brother, in 1685. Charles actually was Charles died. Charles II died. His father was Charles I, who had actually had disintegrated Parliament and wound up costing his head. In addition to, there was a civil war that occurred between the parliamentarians and the royalists in England starting in 1640. But we'll get to that a little bit later. Um, Absolutism promised stability, prosperity, and order, according to these kings, and we're going to concentrate on Louis XIV, who ruled from 1643 to 1715. There were many squabbles among the nobility, meant he had to rule assertively, which means he was like a parent with a bunch of squabbling little kids. Absolutist control meant command of the state's army, control of the legal system, right to collect and spend the state's financial resources. There was a need to create an efficient, centralized bureaucracy, one that was effective, not like the kind of bureaucracies that we see today in the American government. The weak and privileged were special interests, which means that the common people didn't really have a say in government through absolutism. The obstacles to absolutism were legally privileged estates of the nobility and clergy and political authority of semi-autonomous regions. Now, the king couldn't rule all by himself personally, so he had to hire kind of proxies in his place to rule the provinces throughout France. And these people wielded a great deal of power, especially in their own little principalities. Parliaments interfere, diets interfere, estates general interfere in Europe, as we see in the English Civil War of 1640, I believe it's 1649. Parliament actually took over England, and along with their Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell, and this was detrimental to absolutism, but it ushered in a dictatorship. Religion, France, Spain, and Austria, there were attempts to nationalize the church and clergy, and there were attempts to consolidate authority over the church into the hands of the monarchy. Now, what this does is that it makes a state religion, and that is provides for discrimination against people who are members of another religion, and we'll see that in France when we talk about Catholicism and Protestantism. The nobility had important opponents. There were important opponents of royal absolutism. Louis XIV deprived the nobility of power but increased their social prestige at Versailles. Versailles was a palace that Louis XIV had built, very ostentatious palace, and he would invite the nobility there to stay several times a year so he could keep an eye on them. The one thing with absolutism you're going to find is that it is very paranoid. They're always looking for things that would cause them to lose their power, especially palace coups. Now, Peter the Great, who ruled from 1689 to 1725, ruled in Russia, not France. Louis XIV was in France, and he forced his nobility into lifelong government service. Catherine the Great, who ruled from 1762 to 1796 in Russia, the nobility surrendered administrative and political power into the Empress's hands. Associated with Catherine the Great was a lot of court intrigue. In Prussia, which is now present day Germany, the army was staffed by nobles. Joseph II, who ruled from 1765 to 1790, denied the nobility tax exemption and blurred the distinction between noble and commoner. Joseph II, whether he realized it or not, would actually provide some form of equality between the nobility and the common people. The facade that was Louis, performing a lot of the things that Louis XIV did were ceremony. Getting out of bed in the morning was a ceremony. Marching to his throne was a ceremony. These were demonstrations by Louis XIV that, hey, I'm king. That's it. That's all you need to know. And it was a choreography of such for him to perform certain deeds. Now, there wasn't a royal choreography when he had to go to the bathroom or anything like that. I don't think. If there are, there hasn't been anything that was really been has been mentioned in the sources. But it was a lot of pomp and circumstances, very formal. And here is a photo of Charles II. Okay, this is Hyacinthe Rigaud's 1701 portrait of Louis XIV. By the time Louis XIV became king, as most kings in Europe, the act of a king actually leading an army into battle had long gone between the 13th and 15th centuries. So it was more or less posturing or actually descending as a successor from a royal line. Louis XIV was known as the Sun King because he actually hated the dark. A lot of times he'd stay in bed if it was raining or cloudy outside and wouldn't come out unless it was the sun, so they called him the Sun King. Whether this is somewhat of a parody or to make fun of him, uh, you know, I would think it was a form of humor from back then. Nobles were required, like I said, to live at Versailles for part of the year. It raised their prestige because they were around the king, and he could keep an eye on them. He was hardworking and conscientious, and he took personal responsibility for the well-being of his subjects. As far as administration and centralization were concerned, Louis royal power meant domestic tranquility, which means that he was going to see that peace was established whether people liked it or not. Now, this did not apply to foreign policy because Louis made a great deal out of going to war. He would actually spend a lot on the treasury by going to war. He conciliated the upper bourgeoisie, which was the upper middle class, by making them royal administrators. The intendants were administered the 36 generalities into which France was divided. That was their provinces and their local forms of government, and they were unconnected with local elites. This is one thing you need to know. In absolutism, people held office at the king's pleasure. These were his men, people that he appointed. Taxation was very heavy. Collection of taxes was necessary to maintain a large standing army, which Louis had. The daily Deli was the land tax, capitation was the head tax, and the jabel was the salt tax. So you see, the head tax was basically like an income tax, not an income tax, but you were taxed for every person that you had in your home. There were other indirect taxes as well on wine, tobacco, and other goods. Well, we know in France that is the bulk of their economy. Even back then was wine. Tobacco had just been discovered in the New World, and there were other goods like ship stores and gunpowder and things of that nature. Um, Jean Colbert, let's see if we can get to him. Okay, there was regional opposition toward Louis. Was reduced. Members of any parlement, which is a law court, who did not enforce his laws were exiled. Again, there wasn't really a lot of precedent law in France or England at that time, which we knew as stare decisis, which is law based upon previous cases. And he never called the Estats General, which was their parliament. They were last invoked in 1614. Louis saw them as an obstacle to what he wanted to accomplish as far as warfare was concerned. His religious policies, he was determined to impose religious unity on France, and that way God would favor him. Outside of Roman Catholicism, there was the Quietists, who were Catholics that preached personal mysticism. Mysticism is not really part of Catholicism or Christianity, really. It's more or less very supernatural in its practice, and he dispensed with the church as an intermediary, which means that if you wanted to teach directly, wanted to talk directly to God, you didn't need a middleman to do it. And the Quietists were very suspect in Louis's eyes. There were the Jansenists, who held to the Augustinian notion of predestination. Now, what is predestination? That means that before you are born, there is a determination that you are going to go to heaven. This is kind of discriminatory, and Louis didn't favor this. The Jesuits earned the support of Louis because they were Catholics, and they were the ones that basically administered to the population. The Huguenots were French Calvinists who Louis hated, and Protestant churches were destroyed. Protestants banned from many professions, medicine, and printing. Now, if we go back to the Protestant Reformation, which took place in the 16th century, long about 1514 or 1515, when Martin Luther attached his 95 Theses to the uh, church at Württemberg, Germany, where he protested indulgences by the Catholic Church, which was money paid for a ticket to heaven, basically what it was. And Louis was not having any of that. You couldn't really buy salvation. But he put up with the Catholic Church because they didn't pay any taxes. But the Protestants, he thought, were kind of blasphemers at the time. In 1685, Louis revoked the Edict of Nantes. Now, the Edict of Nantes was signed in the 8th or ninth century, and basically what it did was it gave tolerance in France to Protestants practicing along with Catholics, but they were exiled. And laymen were sent to the galleys, which are ships with oars, as slaves. Children were forcibly baptized as Catholics, and 200,000 Protestants fled to England, Holland, Germany, and America. And this was the initial point. Actually, the Pilgrims had they went from England to Holland to practice religious freedom, the Puritans, and then they came to the United States. So a lot of people that entered the America at this time, North America, as we knew it, started in about 1685 when there was wholesale immigration for people to practice Protestantism. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who lived from 1619 to 1683, was the Minister of Royal Finance from 1664 to 1683, and he tightened the process of tax collection. He eliminated tax farming so that more farmers could actually have more money. And in 1664, 25% of taxes collected ended up in the Treasury. By 1683, it was 80%. But he sold public offices. And so it was very difficult for people to actually, um, have an office based upon competence when you have to sell public offices. And this practice would eventually make it to the colonies, predominantly to Louisiana. We see a lot of corruption in Louisiana. It basically started around this time, actually, when the colony was founded in 1699 by Sieur de Bienville. Colbert improved France's roads, bridges, and waterways, and his policies foundered because Louis kept spending more money on war. And by the time Louis died on his deathbed, he told his successor, "Look, don't waste your money on war. Spend it on your people." Uh, in France, Louis wanted limited. The people wanted a limited monarchy, as the case of England. Parliament was a long surviving representative institution. In England, in 1660, after the restoration of the monarchy after the English Civil War, Charles II became king, and his observations were he initially was welcomed by most Englishmen and women, and he declared limited toleration for Protestant dissenters. Why? Because his kinship was from Scotland, and they were Catholic. He promised to observe the Magna Carta and the Petition of Right, and he admired all things French. Now, the Magna Carta was the first plan of government that was signed in 1215 between King John and the barons, taking away a little bit of the absolutism. The Petition of Right was basically granted equal rights to certain people. And French was the language of court. And Charles II admired everything in France because of the simple fact that he had Louis XIV didn't have the restrictions of a parliament, and Charles II did. In the 1670s, Charles II had the open admiration of the kingship. He admired the kingship of Louis XIV, and then we start to see the emergence of political parties. Tories, who were Charles supporters, and Whigs, who were Charles opponents. And both parties feared a return to the Civil War of 1640 as well as royal absolutism, and that was not, they didn't want that. They didn't want the king to have power to where he could absolutely dissolve Parliament, as Charles II's father did, Charles I. Religion. Charles was very sympathetic to Roman Catholicism because he was a Catholic himself. He suspended civil penalties against Catholics and dissenters, but he ignored Parliament. And it basically comes from his idea as what Parliament should be. This led to a series of Whig electoral votes between 1679 and 1681, and there was an exclusion crisis. The Whigs attempted to keep Charles' brother James from obtaining the throne. This was always a bone of contention with monarchies in Europe, was a source of contention. Charles governed without relying on Parliament for money, and he executed several of the Whigs. Now, how do you do that? That's easy. You charge him with treason, you don't have a trial, and you execute him right away. When Charles died in 1685, King James II, his brother, took over the throne, and he was a zealous Catholic, but he alienated a lot of the Tory supporters. King James I, in 1688, he ordered the clergy to read his decree of religious toleration. There was a trial of the bishops that he believed were traitorous to his throne. There was a crisis of succession and the birth of a warming pan baby. That means an illegitimate child. And when you put an illegitimate child into the succession, it throws everything off, even with the legitimacy of other children. The Whigs and the Tories finally invited Mary Stuart and her husband William of Orange to invade England to preserve Protestantism. It was called the Glorious Revolution of 1688. It was a bloodless coup, and James fled the country. William and Mary claimed the throne. Now, when William and Mary came in, they helped pass something called the Bill of Rights, which was passed by Parliament. Now, you'll notice when you look at this, it reaffirmed the trial by jury, habeas corpus, and the right to petition Parliament. Now, in the United States, the Bill of Rights guarantees you a trial by jury. Habeas corpus means that if you are arrested, you have to be told what you are being arrested for, and the right to petition the government. In our Constitution, the citizens have a right to petition the government with their grievances. Now, whether our government does anything in it is I mean, I've seen a lot of grievances that had just been passed by, but in the Bill of Rights in England, this was the bottom floor of what was going to become the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. So England set the pace. In 1689, there was an Act of Toleration which granted dissenters the right to worship freely, but they could not hold public office. It's a form of disintegration. And in order to bypass any type of succession problems in 1701, they ordained that every future English monarch must be a member of the Church of England. That's not necessarily married or born into wedlock or out of wedlock. They had to be married. And in 1707, England and Scotland joined through the Act of Union. So William and Mary were bringing the country together. Why was it glorious? Because there was no bloodshed. It was done very peacefully. It established England as a mixed monarchy governed by the king in Parliament, which would later become known as a constitutional monarchy. The Protestants saw 1688 as another sign of God's special favor in England. The reality in 1688 consolidated the position of large property holders and a restoration of the status quo on behalf of the wealthy. James tried to establish some changes, but when William and Mary came in, they just brought everything back to what it used to be, with the exception of the Act of Succession, the Act of Union, and the Bill of Rights. Now, what I'm going to do is I've started you off. I'm going to post the PowerPoint on Canvas, and you will be able to watch the PowerPoint along with the narration. But when you get your books or whatever books you're using, you can read along and look at the PowerPoint. Especially, it is exceptionally long. That's why I didn't want to do a lecture all online, but I just wanted to let you know. Today was an audio. You will be having video lectures with me, seeing me. So what I want you to do is what I'm going to do is I'm going to welcome you to World History 2, and I hope you enjoy it. It's not that difficult of a course. I will ask you to think at times, and we will hit certain areas of history that you probably didn't know anything about, but were very important into the spread of Western civilization. So this is your instructor, Alan Gotro, and I'll see you next time.